We've all been there. School seems never ending, the pile of homework is even longer, you're having problems with friends, and nothing seems to be going right. But by tomorrow or the next day, you're happy again. Imagine living with this feeling for months on end. Some days are okay, but for the most part, just getting out of bed is a struggle. That's clinical depression.
That I'd feel a weight lift up the moment that I follow through. But I guess I
Before looking at living with clinical depression, it's probably good to start with a little background information. Typically, scientists look at 3 different areas: the brain, genetics, and your own personal temperament. While there is a lot going on in your mind, the most interesting aspect of this is the effect it has on your hippocampus, the emotional output of your brain. Through extensive studies, researchers have found that in people with bouts of depression, their hippocampus was 9 to 13% smaller than someone without clinical depression. This causes the negative mood typically linked with depression. Researchers are hesitant to say that genetics are entirely responsible for mental disorders, but they have found that there is some strong correlation. There's a whole study with the length of a certain gene that can limit enzyme activity, but overall, those who have a clinically depressed parent have about a 3% more likely chance of also developing something. From Molly Cronin's experience as a clinical licensed social worker, she says,
and that is what we understand now, always due to some genetic loading. So that person has some sort of vulnerability, some family history, could be way back in their family tree, where some relative has experienced depression before.
and finally, it all really comes down to your own personal temperament. Miss Carter, the school psychologist, says,
Can't say just one thing, because you could have 2 people experience the same exact situation and have 2 totally different outcomes.
So now that we've established what clinical depression actually is on a scientific scale, let's take a closer look at what it's like to live with depression. 2 high school students were gracious enough to help give some input, but for the sake of their privacy, let's call them Charlie and Elizabeth. They fight a constant battle every day, and it starts the moment they wake up.
Day-to-day issues I have are getting up on time in the morning. I never want to leave my bed because I don't want to deal with the rest of the day. I also have a hard time dealing with my friends sometimes because I get angry at the little things and I blow up and out of proportion.
And with Charlie,
So the easiest way I can describe to you what living with depression is like, it's to imagine wearing a 300-pound shirt all the time. All the time you feel it weighing on you, and even though it can seem like it isn't there, or you can always feel it slowly pushing you down. Sometimes you want to do something, and you just get too weighed down, and there are times when the weight gets heavier. Then eventually it gets back to the original weight. The only thing it never does is lighten.
clearly, it's now easy to see that living with clinical depression is no easy matter. But there's another part that needs to be said: the stigma. If you don't know, a stigma is a negative stereotype towards a person or an idea, which is certainly not lost in clinical depression. From a professional standpoint, it has gotten better.
Certainly in my long career of almost 40 years in mental health, I have seen much improvement. I think the schools and various organizations have done a really good job of educating people about this. So while the stigma still exists, I believe it is much less so than previous generations. Do we still have a lot of work to do? You bet. But like with any major illness, whether it is diabetes or a heart condition, it's really important not to ignore it and to get it well treated.
While this might be the case, you can't fully understand its effects on the individual unless you actually experience it yourself. Elizabeth sees the stigma this way.
The stigma's affected me by making me embarrassed and ashamed of who I am because I feel like I have an illness, that something's wrong with me. I also strongly dislike when people talk about it and give their opinions without all the facts. People are very insensitive sometimes, and it always makes me more embarrassed, and I get angry.
Similarly, Charlie does too.
A lot of people believe that depression is just being constantly sad, and it's not. It's apathy that people mistake for sadness. Feeling something is such a grace to depressed people, and it's hard to do that. The other stigma is that depression isn't serious, but it is. It adds a crazy amount of stress to an already stressful school life. The thing is that stigma is so ingrained that it prevents people from getting the help they need. And I suffer from this too. So the main thing is that depression doesn't stop you from being happy. It stops you from healing. And it teaches you to hide from everyone. So they shame you for the way you are.
This in mind, it's a little easier to see what they go through. Life can be a struggle sometimes, and there's no escaping it. However, Elizabeth and others like her don't see it as entirely a bad thing.
I want others to know that we didn't choose to have a chemical imbalance, and there's nothing wrong with us. We're simply different, and that doesn't make us any less important than people without it. I actually believe it makes us stronger because it's just another thing we deal with and that we live with. It may be a battle every day, but it isn't hurting us to fight the battle.
So today, we've looked at how clinical depression comes to be, what living with it is like, and how the stigma affects those afflicted. I've learned so much from these four, and I'm so glad that they were willing to share my story with me. Discussions like these need to be said, so that people like Charlie and Elizabeth no longer feel like they have to hide or be ashamed of who they are. I hope going forward, you have a fuller understanding of what clinical depression actually is, and a more open-mindedness to go forward to the future.